So you think that only stupid people believe in God, or maybe you've had personal experience with feeling the sting of people that think you're stupid just because you believe in God. Even if they didn't tell it to your face, you felt it. Well, this video is for you, because the truth of it is believers are not stupid people, and I can prove it. So let's take a deep dive into this now. But first, do stick around to the end, because I'll have some interesting statistics that you might find worth the wait. Back when I was an avowed atheist, there really wasn't this cynical sarcasm that we see in all the commentary these days. The likes of Christopher Hitchens or Bill Maher, who publicly and unashamedly have great disdain for believers, and Christians in particular. Their disdain just drips from their so-called analyses. And their fellow atheists also reveal this incredible dismissiveness. Bill Maher even goes to the extent of calling God your sky daddy. You couldn't be more obvious, could he? That he is oh so smart and you are just oh so dumb. So that sort of intellectualism that they parade around, they think that science somehow girds their belief system, and that believers really have a childlike, fantastical imagination. But here's the thing, I think they have a very incorrect understanding of science, because you see, scientists are actually very open-minded. You can't do science if you aren't, because you don't start in experiments with the end point in mind. You start it with an open question, and then you do the experiment to find out the answer, not the reverse. So that's the whole point of science, is that you are open-minded. So for them to use science this way seems disingenuous, shall I say? Perhaps stupid. Anyway, so they seem to be very prideful and have this disdain for others. Now, I don't know if it's the times we live in, or it's just the atheists themselves that have changed. But back in my day, we really didn't care what other people believed. We only cared what we believed. So it didn't matter to us if they had the nativity scene at the city hall, or children put on a Christmas play. We used to have Mary and Joseph plays every year. And somehow that didn't manage to make me a Christian. I turned out an atheist all the same. So there's this ridiculous notion somehow, at least it seems to me, that they think Christianity is contagious or infectious, and it needs to be quarantined to protect the public good, you know. So anyway, I don't know what's changed, but something clearly has. When I was a child, kids used to fight over who got the role of Mary and Joseph. It was like a treasured role. And as I said, somehow, despite all that, I still turned out to be an atheist. So putting religion in schools doesn't really change a person that much. What they're going to believe, they're going to ultimately believe, probably based upon their own life experiences. Anyway, the point is, science and religion are not mutually exclusive. And I think that they do not have the big picture. And I think that they're very myopic or short-sighted, if you prefer that term, in terms of their understanding of these things that they so quickly and easily dismiss. I watched the debate between John Lennox and Christopher Hitchens in preparation for this video. And there's a point where Lennox points out that Hitchens looks through the telescope and says, see, there's proof there's no God, there's no heaven. I'm not sure what he was expecting. Was expecting to see it like on a map? But anyway, other people, as Lennox points out, look through that same microscope and are in awe at what they see. So there's a difference there. There's a fundamental difference. One's using the telescope as a tool to better see. The other's using it as a conclusion, when that's not really what science is. So anyway, to learn about the universe, I think you need to have that broader, more expansive understanding. And atheism doesn't explain the big why of it all. So what if religion isn't in opposition to science, but they work complementary? There's this fallacy that they're competing with each other, and that you're mutually exclusive. You can't have one without the other. But there are actually many scientists who do believe in God. I'm talking biochemists, geneticists, mathematicians, astrophysicists, medical doctors, and people that are actually working in science every day in academia, and the kind of people that hold multiple advanced degrees, and their intelligence is beyond reproach. You couldn't say these are stupid people. They're not. They're at the highest levels. But anyway, many of them actually were atheists, some of them militant atheists in their past, But as they went further in the education, they became believers. So there are many reasons, and actually many great minds, that believe in both science and God. Now, I know you know the ones from the 16th and the 17th century, men like Sir Isaac Newton, Copernicus, Galileo, or and so on. And I can hear your objections already. But back in their day, everybody believed, right? So them believing isn't a biggie. But what if I told you there's people from today, more contemporary minds, that are scientists, and they believe in God? I think that people wouldn't be so easy to dismiss people. So the first guy I'm going to talk about is John Lennox, born in 1943, now 80, still has a sharp mind. And you can see any of his videos on YouTube. He's published 70 major research papers and is an author. And he studies the problems in math. So he has a PhD from Cambridge, for crying out loud. This guy's a really smart man. You couldn't say he's any kind of stupid. He has also said that it was indeed mathematics that made a believer out of him. Atheism, he said, cannot explain mathematics. Science cannot explain mathematics. It was C.S. Lewis that helped him see that far from being illogical, Christianity was very logical, indeed just as logical as mathematics is. So the two go hand in hand. They can't be separated. The rise of modern Christianity, he said, came from Christianity's belief in God. And he's not ashamed to call himself Christian because it was Christianity that gave him his life's work, science. Without the order inherent in math, we couldn't do science. It's the rules of math that make science possible. And interestingly, he sees his career doing math as a form of worship. He says there's incredible beauty to math and to all of how it works. And so the laws of math that most people never see or understand, I rather doubt that Mayer or Hitchens would understand either. What John Lennox is saying about mathematics is because they simply do not understand what John Lennox knows. So they simply do not understand what John Lennox knows from a career of doing math. They're just simply ignorant of that level of knowledge. So I'm left thinking that Mayer and Christopher Hitchens are the stupid ones here. What else can we conclude? Interestingly, Lennox says we do all for the glory of God, and that it's not restricted to a church building where we worship. So what we do or how we live our lives is an act of worship to God. Now, I remember thinking way back when I was younger and still an atheist, even then I started to see God as much larger, something much bigger. So something that didn't fit into a building or into a book. It didn't fit neatly that way. It was bigger, it was larger. So as an analogy, John Lennox compares the combustion engine and Henry Ford and the motor car. He says, would we ever argue that you could have one without the other, that one could exist without the other? No, he says, in an interview in Christian Science Today, God is not in competition with science. God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with the laws of internal combustion engine in the creation of a motor car. And he says that's something anyone can understand. And to do anything else is really quite reductionist. It's arguing down to the very smallest when, in fact, things should be looked at much more expansively. So again, it goes back to what my thinking was, is that Hitchens and Mayer are both myopic. They don't have the vision necessary to see things in a larger perspective. Instead, we've been taught reductionism in our schools for decades now. So back in the 70s, you think back to it, and kids were being taught that they're nothing but a bunch of chemicals. And then they could be reduced down to those chemicals and actually sold for just a few bucks. So, I'm thinking to myself, is this maybe why we have all these school shootings? Kids have been taught that they're really not worth very much, that they could be reduced down to nothing but chemicals. They're nothing very special. It kind of makes me wonder. So they're literally being taught that they're of little worth and not special, And maybe, just maybe, that's the cause of all this. I'm just wondering. So anyway, they've been taught reductionist thinking. And again, similar along those lines of reductionist thinking, whenever there's one of these shootings, everybody starts saying it's the guns, it's the guns. But isn't that a bit too narrow of a question? I think maybe if we don't ask the right questions, expansionary questions, large questions, the big questions, that we'll never get to the right answer. So maybe it's not a gun problem. Maybe it's a reductionist visionary problem. Maybe it's a thinking problem. Maybe it's a moral problem. Maybe it's a spiritual problem. I don't know. Maybe it's a sense of worth problem with these kids that are doing these horrendous things. But what I do know is that I don't see any politicians asking these sorts of questions, these expansionary questions. Instead, they're all very reductionist, and you get into this argument about guns and rights and all that. But it's just, to me, the wrong focus. Again, sorry, I got off on a tangent here. But if you are interested in me doing more of an analysis of that and maybe looking at religion in schools and the effect on the culture, I could do an entire video on that probably. Let me know in the comments section below if that's something that you'd be interested in listening to me talk about and hearing the research that I find. I tend to look at things from the big picture, and that's probably because of my master's degree in cultural anthropology. So I'm always interested in the culture, and I did an undergrad degree in psychology. So I kind of like to look at things both from the individual perspective and then to the larger culture perspective and the interplay between both. So anyway, let's get back to the scientists that are believers in God. So we've talked about one mathematician, John Lennox. So I'm going to look at another mathematician now. And I didn't start out to talk about a lot of mathematicians, but that's where my research led me when I was preparing this video. I know that math kind of sometimes isn't people's most fond subject. It's probably not yours. But I got to thinking about my own journey too when I was reading about all these mathematicians. And I realized that math also played a part in me changing from an atheist to an agnostic. It was in my early 20s when I was studying advanced calculus that I realized that at the very highest levels of advanced math, things become really quite amazing. I mean, the ability to calculate the instantaneous velocity of an airplane at any given moment in its flight path, that's just incredible. Who knew? I mean, I didn't before I started advanced calculus. But it was a thing of poetic beauty almost, this higher levels of math, a sort of divine order that I hadn't really ever quite thought about before and certainly was hard to grasp. And so my atheism began to crack a little bit, but just a bit. It would still be many more years before it fell away, but it had started. Now, if I'm not explaining what I'm about to talk about very well, I apologize. I'm not a math whiz by any stretch, and it is a bit complex. So I think for most of us, it's a bit difficult. But anyway, the next scientist I'm going to talk about is Dr. Jason Lisle, and he's an author of The Secret Code of Creation and The Proof of Creation. And I may need to add those books to my extensive list. It's getting longer every day. Maybe when I'm in retirement, I'll be able to read all these books. But anyway, he's an astrophysicist of all things. Born in Ohio with a master's degree and a PhD in astrophysics. So he says quite simply, there is no secular explanation for what we discovered in the 1980s. So what was the discovery that he's referring to? Well, he has an entire video and it goes into a lot of details, but I'll try to recap as best I can because I'm no math whiz. So the discovery that Dr. Lisle is talking about is the Mandelbrot set. Now, bear with me for a second. There's a bit of background here so we recall what set is, because for many of us, math was a long time ago. But I promise you it's worth it. So we'll start with a simple basic definition. What is a set? A set, for example, could be even numbers are part of one set and odd numbers are part of another set. So these two sets don't overlap. They're two very distinct sets. So now comes the Mandelbrot set, discovered by Benoit Mandelbrot in the late 70s, I believe it was. And he used this equation to explain or to show the complexity of nature, or the complexity that's possible from a very simple equation. Here's that equation. So when you plot the numbers into this equation using negative numbers and positive numbers, you get an interesting shape that comes out of it all. And so there you take the numbers, you put them on the X and Y axis, like you may remember from school. And one set of the numbers gets infinitely larger and just stretches out to eternity. The other set numbers cluster in and around the XY axis. Together, these numbers create what's called a cardioid pattern. And it's similar to a heart shape, and it's the equivalent of if you could get it by tracing the outer circle of the circumference of a circle as it rolls around that circle. And here's what it looks like. The really interesting thing about this pattern is that it keeps repeating itself endlessly, and each replication of it is exactly the same as the one before it. So this discovery changed how mathematicians see math, and it became understood that there are laws to math. So there is amazing order and patterns to the laws of math. So we discovered the law of math. We didn't invent it. It was discovered, it was revealed to us because of advances in technology related to computer science, but it had always been present. Math, unlike biology, which uses evolutionary theory to explain, doesn't quite fit into evolutionary theory because math does not evolve. It's not made of atoms, and yet it's a constant. So it's kind of a wonder how or why these laws even exist, because keep in mind, math is not something that you can touch. Math is a conceptual thing. Yes, you can count to math, but it's a representation of our conceptual idea that three objects we'll call three. You can't touch the number three. You can count to three, but you cannot physically touch the concept of three. So how do you have laws to something that's come out of our own mind, except to say that they've always existed and we just discovered them through science? So now, as we know, atheists claim that evolution somehow proves that God does not exist. But math isn't like an animal. Math does not evolve. It's eternal. So it's kind of like God. It's eternal. So think of the old Pythagorean theorem that we all learned about in school. Remember the triangles? And if you knew a squared plus b squared would always equal c squared. So if you knew just two sides, you could always calculate the third. So when it was discovered in ancient times, it was revealed. It wasn't that it had said something that we'd created or something that had evolved. It had always been true that there was that relationship with the triangle, the three sides. So as Dr. Lyle puts it, there are elemental laws of math, and they stem from the mind of God, and they go beyond the physical universe. They are conceptually universal. They are invariant. They are exceptionalist entities. So like 2 plus 2 is always going to be 4 no matter where you are. So it makes sense in the worldview of a Christian mindset, but it doesn't make sense in the atheist view. So that's why many mathematicians were surprised by it or seemed revolutionary or stunned. But it's really fractal geometry that Benoit Mandelbrot discovered. And it provides the order to plants and shorelines and mountains and cells. There's all kinds of things that this fractal geometry applies to. And Dr. Lyle has written an interesting book on fractals, which I have to add to my reading list, which is getting longer all the time. Not sure if I can actually read all these books, but I'm going to try. And as I do, I will create videos about them. But here's a look at the cover for his book if you want to purchase it. You can also find in my playlist the full video of Dr. Lyle talking about fractals. And if you're really into math and you want to see more, because he goes into a lot more detail than I just kind of gave it short cover, a lot of detail and a lot of amazing, very beautiful, very breathtaking images that have come out of the Mandelbrot set. So I really encourage you to look at that, but it's in my playlist. So go looking for it if you're really into math and seeing cool things. So the interesting thing is that the Mandelbrot set is telling us something about how God thinks. At least that's what Lennox thinks. Sorry, not Lennox, Lyle, Dr. Lyle thinks. And that is that God's understanding is infinite, and that the numbers are just an aspect of God's mind. So, like so many other scientists, he sees that there's an intelligence in these patterns. And moreover, the Mandelbrot set isn't the only one of these patterns. So for Lyle, the computer science only revealed the beauty, the breathtaking beauty of these beautiful patterns. But neither computer science nor atheism can actually explain them. It's only when you stop and think of a God that you then have an explanation as to why. So for Lyle, it was astonishing discovery that maybe amazed the secular mathematicians, but it wasn't a surprise or shocking to Christians because of their beliefs. So just like Newton and all the others I mentioned earlier, who looked for laws of nature, Lyle also said it makes sense that there should be laws for math, because in fact there is a lawgiver. Otherwise, where do these universal laws come from? Okay, so that's enough of the mathematicians. I hope I haven't put you all to sleep. I can see your eyes glazing over. Let's take a look at someone you might be more familiar with. Dr. Francis Collins. Now, that's a name you might recognize because he's an American physician and geneticist who discovered many genes that are associated with a number of diseases, and who also led up the Human Genome Project, which many people have heard of when they ultimately mapped out the entire human genome. So you would think of all people that should be an atheist, because he's in the area of biology and evolutionary theories in biology, that he should be an atheist. And you would be correct, except that he was only an atheist in the early part of his career. As he attained more and more education, as he rose to higher and higher levels of understanding in science, in the field of science, he became less of an atheist. So at 74, even though now he is no longer an atheist, but he was raised an atheist and didn't believe in God, even for the first parts of his education, which were in physical chemistry and quantum mechanics. So yes, he started out solidly atheist. In fact, so solidly atheist that it was his plan to prove that atheism was correct, because as he puts it, any thinking person would believe that. There you go again. If you're not an atheist, you're not a thinking person. This just permeates our culture and our mindset. So anyway, the flip side is that those that believe in God really are not stupid, because you can see there's a pattern here amongst these scientists. The further they go in their education and the harder that Collins looked for evidence, the flimsier he found the so-called proof to be. And so after 2 years of struggling to find that proof that proved atheism was correct, and with growing and increasing doubt, it was on a very clear day in the Northwest on a hike. He had an epiphany, that he had a moment of truth come to him like a bolt of lightning. He came to the conclusion that the belief in God was the most plausible explanation for all that he had come to know through science. So science was the tool that led him to God. Isn't that really something? The years and years of trying to prove that atheism is correct, and using science to do so, it couldn't be done. I don't think Bill Maher and Christopher Hitchens understand things at the same level that the three men I've already talked about do. So who's the stupid one here? Scientist number 4 comes to us from China, and he has a fascinating backstory. He went to MIT and also Harvard. He has an MD and a PhD in laser physics. Man is clearly another brilliant scientist. And yes, he started out as an atheist as well, much like Francis Collins. As he puts it, he was born an atheist in China, where religion is forbidden, or was at the time. He came to America as an atheist, and he had always been a scientific-minded atheist. His words. And that same refrain we keep hearing, science and atheism are joined at the hip, and only intelligent, educated minds think that way. But it was only after his second degree in medicine that he became a believer. And it was the study of the human eye that made him become a believer. Because, as he says, there's just no way that trillions of cells in the eye come together in just the 9 months of every single pregnancy. There are just so many things that can go wrong, and yet so rarely do. So just how extremely complex things happen could not be explained with an atheist world view. As he puts it, the eye simply could not have evolved out of randomness. There had to be a creator behind it, because things this complex simply do not just happen from random series of events. And as he points out, even Darwin struggled to fit the eye neatly into evolutionary theory. It just wasn't a very good fit. Now, Dr. Wang sees the eye as the Achilles heel for evolutionary theory. Its structure is just too complex and too specific to conform to evolutionary theory, which says that changes happen in small little small pieces, small changes. So anyway, religion, because religion and science don't have to be in conflict. I think that's what you're seeing a pattern here of. It's because this man, Dr. Wang, has over 31 years of education, and so he's no dummy. In terms of the eye, he has the most amount of knowledge pretty much possible for a person to have. And as he went through his education, he only became more and more of a believer in God, not less. So here we're seeing that same pattern at the highest levels of understanding things, using science as a tool. There is an increased pattern of belief in God. So this, to me, only reinforces my original thought that many of those atheists like Hitchens or Bill Maher, and I know there's quite a number of other famous ones, they're very myopic or short-sighted, and they have a limited grasp of many things. They think they know, but they don't. And that's kind of the worst that they say. You have a little bit of knowledge becomes dangerous. So as you go higher up the education level, you find more and more people that are believers. So education creates more, not less believers. Now, maybe the smarter you are and the more you believe, and the atheists are just merely missing the big picture. Maybe that's what's going on here. And maybe they're missing the big picture because of their own ignorance, or dare I say it, their own stupidity. So if you're interested in learning more on how Dr. Wang became a Christian and his incredible backstory, he has a new book out called From Darkness to From Darkness to Light, which sounds like it's going to be a really good read. And I love the double entendre with the name. Darkness of spiritually to light to belief in God, and darkness from blindness of the eye to seeing. It looks like it's another good one I need to add to my book reading list. So in my own journey from atheism to God, I find yet another parallel. It was way back when I was in university and I was learning about human development at the embryonic level, in the womb, at the cellular level, how everything has to line up and how it's so complex. And just like Dr. Wang, I was in awe of the complexity, how things have to line up just right. And it's somehow a miracle. At least it seemed like a miracle to me. It's pretty much a miracle that any of us turn out okay. Yeah, there's sometimes it doesn't, but the pieces have to fall into place, and they so often do, and there's so many of them. So just how do cells know where to migrate to in a forming fetus? How does the cell for the eyes know to travel to the place where the eyeball should be? And this happens every day. And so I became fond of saying that miracles happen. We just call them babies. I said it occasionally, but I thought it a whole lot more. The way that somehow a life is sparked into existence from two things that separately, on their own, the sperm and the egg, are not life, and yet they come together and they are. So I think we've lost our sense of wonder and awe at this whole process, and it's become cavalier and throwaway. And I think similar to the scientists I've discussed so far, the more I learned, the more I became a believer, and my atheism cracked just a little bit more. It was starting to slip away. I was starting to move into being agnostic, and it was a slow process. Maybe I'm just a slow learner, I don't know. But eventually I went from atheist to agnostic. And so now we're at our fifth scientist, and this last scientist is Dr. Sai. He's a retired biochemist, and he comes from 3 generations of far-left communists. His family was very militantly atheist. And like his father, he started off studying chemistry, and then he was still an atheist. And then he went on to study physics, and he later got a PhD in biochemistry. And as he tells his story, he says he had a feeling that something was missing in his belief system as an atheist, and he found the answers in science. What he learned did not fit into the materialistic perspective that he had long held, and which atheists do, that we can only study what we see and touch. That's the only things we can know, or things that we can see, touch, and measure. And so it didn't seem particularly valid to him that atheism was the explanation. Felt like something was missing. And I've also mentioned he saw the incredible complexity discoverable through the lens of science. And he put him in a state of awe, like the others, best explained by the existence of God. He could not find the answers within a purely materialistic perspective or the atheistic perspective. So he started to wonder if science has any way to find the truth, and that the answers really can only come from God, or a belief in God. Like me, it was going to be many more steps until he became a believer. But he feels his first step was to break down his resistance to the idea of believing. Like me, he went from atheism to agnosticism and then to belief. And it was because of science, not despite science. So the facts don't support a strict atheistic perspective on how life works. Evolution, he says, is just too glib. It cannot explain such things as the origin of life. So through it, although he started to be an ardent atheist, he became less and less so as he learned more and more, like so many of the others. And then he started having specific dreams. And then he started to have waking experiences, which sound very supernatural, and that he could only explain as being the Holy Spirit. And I'm looking forward to reading his book too. It's called In the Hands of God, I think it is. So his belief in God comes both from his life's work as a scientist and also from his personal experiences. So it's going to be an interesting read. I'm going to show you the cover here in a second, but I'll review his work, I think, like I will the others. So many of these guys, they deserve a standalone video, and I may well do that once I've done reading their books. Certainly I'll do more videos about scientists that believe in God. And the reason being is it needs to be stated again and again and again, because there's just too pervasive of a notion that very smart people don't believe in God. In fact, there are very many smart people who do. So absolutely, the belief in God is not stupid. So keep that in mind if you believe in God and you're bucking the overall secular trend that we see everywhere these days. Always remember you're in very good company. And for those of you that were hanging on to the end, waiting for what I promised to be very interesting statistics, there was a 2009 poll in which it was found that 51% of scientists believe in God or a higher power. So that's a statistical majority, a slight majority. I'll give you that. It's true, but it's still a majority. But what's even more surprising is when you look at the number of Nobel Prizes awarded between 1901 and 2000, that so many of them were awarded to Christians. So in breaking that down a bit more, we find that Nobel Peace Prizes, 78.3% of them were Christians. For chemistry, the award was 72.5% to Christians. For the physics prize, it was 65.3%. And 62% of awards in medicine went to Christians. So these are people that are at the very pinnacle of their careers, people with the highest level of human knowledge. And in this group, it's a very clear majority that are believers. So there you go. And if you're wondering where these numbers came from, they're from a book that is called 100 Years of Nobel Prizes, and it was published in the year 2003. Hope some of that helps. Please subscribe. Hit the subscribe button down there. Leave me some comments. Would love to hear your feedback. Not looking for any feedback from any haters, because I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm just kind of putting out there what I have found to be true. So if you know someone that might benefit from this, I hope you'll share the video with them. And I look forward to creating more of these. I'm having actually a lot of fun and learning a whole bunch of stuff. And my videos, I think, will get better and better. Sorry about the production problems and the many other things that you learn as you go. But it's been fun. Talk to you again soon.